Hello, and welcome back to The Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Lawrence Joseph Barder and John Johnson, who was more commonly known as Fritz. Lawrence was born in Akron, Ohio, on the 2nd of December 1926. He was one of at least 5 children born to Stephen and Charlotte Barder. In 1944, Lawrence dropped out of high school in order to join the Navy. Returning from service in 1946, he completed his high school education and then enrolled at the University of Akron. Here he met his future wife, a lady by the name of Mary Lou Knapp. After just one term at the University of Akron, he dropped out and began working at a local restaurant. Several years later, on the 19th of April 1952, Lawrence and Mary Lou got married and they moved to a small bungalow in the West Hills neighbourhood of Akron. Over the next 5 years, they had 3 children together, Mary, Lawrence Jr. and Stephen. In May 1957, Mary Lou was 5 months pregnant with their 4th child. By this time, Lawrence was working for Lifetime Distributors as a kitchenware salesman. On the 15th of May 1957, Lawrence needed to visit Cleveland on business. He packed his fishing gear and a small case into the car and told Mary Lou that he planned to go fishing after his meetings were completed. Mary Lou suggested that he should come straight home instead, as the weather was forecast to get worse later that day, to which Lawrence replied, "Maybe I will and maybe I won't." He left home at around midday and, before making the 40-mile journey to Cleveland, he cashed a cheque for $400 and then paid some bills, including his insurance premium. Once his business was completed, Lawrence drove to Eddie's Boathouse on the Rocky River near Lake Erie. Here he met the owner, Lawrence Kotler, and asked to rent a fishing boat. The owner was concerned that weather conditions were expected to be rough later in the day, but Lawrence was adamant that he wanted to rent the boat. Paying a $15 deposit, Lawrence rented a 14-foot fishing boat with a small outboard motor. A short time into his fishing trip, the Coast Guard saw Lawrence and again warned him of the impending storm. Lawrence reassured the Coast Guard that he was okay and went on his way. Not long afterwards, a storm hit the area. The following morning, 16th of May 1957, Lawrence's boat was found approximately 5 miles down the shore from the boatyard, on the rocks at Perkins Beach in Lakewood. The boat had sustained minor damage, and inside was 1 oar, an empty gas canister, life vests, and fishing gear. There was no sign of Lawrence. A search and investigation followed. It was established that the boat had not capsized, and the assumption was made that Lawrence had been swept off of the boat by a large wave during the storm. Despite Lawrence being a strong swimmer, the Coast Guard stated that at the time of Lawrence's disappearance, the lake was so rough that no one could have survived if swept overboard. The search for Lawrence was eventually called off, and, at his wife's request, he was declared dead in 1960. John Johnson, who was more commonly known as Fritz, was born in 1926. He never knew his biological parents, being one of 22 babies found on doorsteps in Boston that year. All of the male babies were given the same name, John Johnson. They were then given a different nickname, which was how he became known as Fritz. Fritz joined the Navy when he was 17 years old and served in both World War II and the Korean War. He was hospitalised for a back injury and as a result of this was discharged from the army in early 1957. In May that year, Fritz was hired as a bartender by Ross's Steakhouse in Omaha, Nebraska. He had a larger-than-life character and was popular with the patrons from day one. He was flamboyant and unconventional and soon became well known within the local community. Before long, he had secured a job as a DJ at the local radio station before moving on to become a presenter at the local news channel. Popular, upbeat and fun, Fritz had a pencil moustache and was often seen wearing a leather beret. He was known for his elaborate champagne parties that were hosted in his apartment, which did not have furniture but instead floors covered with pillows. Fritz had many eccentricities, including a strange habit of dating his checks by season rather than the day, month and year. In order to raise awareness for a polio drive, he completed a publicity stunt where he sat in a box on top of a 50-foot flagpole for 30 days. During this time, he arranged for friends to send martinis in milk bottles up to the top of the flagpole. This seemed to solidify his popularity and people's affection for his quirky character. Despite always speaking openly about his dislike of marriage, in 1961, at the age of 35, Fritz married a 20-year-old model by the name of Nancy Zimmer. Nancy had a daughter from her previous marriage who Fritz adopted. 2 years later, in 1963, they had a son together. The year after his son's birth, Fritz was treated for a cancerous tumour behind his left eye. He underwent surgery to remove the tumour, which left him needing to wear an eye patch, something which he adopted in his usual flamboyant style. On the 2nd of February 1965, Fritz attended an archery tournament in Chicago, nearly 500 miles away from his home in Omaha. Whilst demonstrating archery equipment, Fritz was spotted by a man from Akron, Ohio, who noticed that Fritz had a striking resemblance to an Akron man who had died in a boating accident 8 years earlier, Lawrence Barder. The man knew that Lawrence's niece, Suzanne Pica, lived nearby and asked her to meet him at the archery tournament. When Suzanne arrived, she was shocked by Fritz's likeness to her uncle. Despite the moustache and eye patch, the resemblance was uncanny. Suzanne approached Fritz, who laughed it off and said that he had never heard of Lawrence Barder. However, Suzanne was so convinced that Fritz was her uncle that she contacted Lawrence's brothers, John and Dick. They both lived over 350 miles away in Akron. The brothers quickly made their way to Chicago and were also convinced that the man standing in front of them was, in fact, their dead brother, Lawrence. Despite having no idea who Lawrence was, Fritz agreed to have his fingerprints taken so that the brothers could compare them with those held on Lawrence's military records and find peace in the fact that he wasn't their brother. However, the following day, the fingerprints were confirmed as a match. John Fritz Johnson and Lawrence Joseph Barder were the same person. The lives of both Lawrence and Fritz's wives were immediately turned upside down. Mary Lou had mourned the loss of her husband and helped her children come to terms with the loss of their father. She had been receiving monthly Social Security payments of around $250 and had received a life insurance payout. This payout was the one which Lawrence had paid the premium for on the day that he went missing. Mary Lou now faced the prospect of having to repay this. She had slowly begun to rebuild her life and had fallen in love again and was engaged to be married. However, she now found that she was still legally married to Lawrence and, because of her Catholic faith, unable to divorce, leaving her new relationship in tatters. Fritz's second wife, Nancy, found her marriage annulled, and despite initially stating that she would be standing by her husband, they separated soon after from the strain of dealing with these events. Fritz was quoted as saying that he felt physical shock as though he had been hit in the face when he heard the result of the fingerprint comparison. He stated that he had no recollection of his life as Lawrence and was now faced with the fact that his memories of his life as Fritz were not true. Questions were soon asked as to whether Fritz had suffered from a rare and unusual case of amnesia, or if this was all an elaborate hoax by a man who wanted a new life. He was assessed at length by a team of psychiatrists who concluded that they believed that he had no recollection of his previous life, but they also could not find any psychological reason which would explain his memory loss. Questions remained as to whether Fritz would be prosecuted for both fraud and bigamy. With these questions hanging over him, Fritz was fired by his job at the TV station and had to return to bar work to earn money. Now with 2 families, including 6 children to support, he struggled to make ends meet. Lawrence Kotler, the owner of the boat from which Lawrence disappeared, came looking for compensation for his damaged boat, and Fritz ended up living at the Omaha YMCA. In order for Fritz to be prosecuted, it would need to be established that his acts were deliberate. On one hand, Fritz was consistent and clear in the fact that he had no recollection of his previous life, and in August 1965, when he met with Mary Lou and their 4 children, the youngest of which he had never met, he was adamant that they were all strangers to him. Psychologists stated that cases of amnesia where a person fills in time with false memories, whilst rare, were certainly possible, and he could have sustained an injury during the storm that night. It was also suggested that the tumour which he had removed in 1964 could have been responsible for his memory loss. However, on the other hand, it was also established at the time of Lawrence's disappearance that he was over $20,000 in debt and was also in trouble with the IRS for not filing tax returns from 1951 through to 1957. The complete contrast between his 2 different lifestyles may have hinted at someone who felt trapped in his life and was desperate for a way out. Opinion was and remains divided as to what really happened. Before any investigation was concluded, Fritz died from liver cancer on the 16th of September 1966 at St. Joseph's Medical Hospital in Omaha. He was just 39 years old. A service was held for Fritz at the First Methodist Church in Omaha, and then the following day his body was transported to Akron so that Lawrence could be buried in a family plot at the Holy Cross Cemetery. He was never prosecuted for any crime, if indeed any crime did occur. I would be really interested to hear your opinions on Fritz's innocence or guilt in the comment section below. That concludes today's story. Thank you very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Happy New Year, everybody. 2021. Please be kind. Goodbye.